Sound, in its purest and simplest form, begins as a sine wave. Each wave is measured in cycles per second. Wavelength is measured from peak to peak or trough to trough. When sound is created, it propagates as vibrations through a medium such as air, creating compression and rarefaction, and these two incidents generate our wave. Frequency is a term that refers to the number of cycles per second created by a wave. Low frequencies have a lower value of cycles per second, while higher frequencies have a higher value. Amplitude is a term that refers to the volume of the wave. It denotes the amount of air pressure that is displaced by the wave itself. Now we've discussed a sound wave in its simplest form, known as a sine wave. Now we must look at what happens when we have complex waves that are generated in most atmospheric situations. Everything in nature that makes sound emits these waveforms with thousands of frequencies involved. And that brings us to harmonics. Now these aren't the type of harmonies that you're used to hearing when people are singing together. Instead, these are the waveforms that are produced by something we call resonance, or the vibration of elements around the sound source. And this is where different sounds get their own unique tone. With the right harmonic frequencies involved, we gain a sense of warmth, or maybe thinness, or sharpness, or brightness, or brilliance in a sound. Sound pressure level, or SPL, is a logarithmic measurement of the effective pressure of a sound relative to a reference value. Decibels, or dB, are logarithmic units used to express the value of sound pressure levels. So if I were to say that a sound is 88.1 decibels, I would be referring to the amount of sound pressure that is emitted by the sound. In essence, SPL is a reference of volume. Since SPL is a standardized measurement using the decibel, we can often refer to averages from sounds in our normal environment and expect a certain decibel level to be emitted from them. So a jet taking off rates at about 140 decibels on average, and a typical conversation rates at about 65 decibels, depending on who you're talking to. On average, your ears should only be exposed to 90 decibels for up to 8 hours at a time. Once those levels are at 104 decibels, your limitation in terms of time goes down to 15 minutes before hearing damage can occur. This chart shows where listening fatigue begins at 70 dB, all the way up to 90 decibels. Above 100 decibels, there is an increasing risk to your hearing. It is recommended that you take precaution with your hearing. The use of earplugs can exponentially extend the lifetime of your ears, and since you're going to use them every day, it's probably a good idea to know exactly what decibel levels you would expect when you're in a specific environment. Now, the human hearing range on average extends from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. As we age, unfortunately, the follicles in our ears tend to die off and limit the amount of high frequencies we can actually interpret. The most amazing thing about musical instruments in regards to the human hearing range is that all instruments have been designed to fit somewhere inside the hearing spectrum. Just looking at a typical drum set alone, we realize that the drum set itself fulfills the majority of the human hearing range. The need for more cowbell, so to speak, fulfilled a mid-range quality that some other elements of the drum set could not fulfill. Vocal frequencies focus a lot of their energy on the mid-band range. Some would say that the range of vocals and dialogue was specifically placed in the mid-band to counter the equal loudness curve, also known as the Fletcher-Munson curve. The equal loudness curve states that high and low frequencies are not as easily perceived at lower volumes. Once volumes begin to extend above 90 decibels, they tend to level out between the high, mid, and low frequencies. This, of course, answers the age-old question of why you would ever need one of these in your car. Our human ears desire to hear their spectrum fulfilled, and that's why the best mixes that you'll hear in audio always utilize the 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz spectrum in the most even way possible. Which brings us to white noise. White noise is a signal-generated set of waveforms that are randomized throughout the spectrum to provide a balanced and even approach to testing equipment and sound spaces. Pink noise, much like white noise, utilizes the same elements, except there's more of an expression of equal loudness down in the lower frequencies. Now, of course, comes our little talk about phase. Phase really only occurs when we either have two signals, one source and two microphones, or a multitude of microphones, or if we're really just talking about the reflections inside of a room as waveforms begin to multiply. And it all sounds very complex and all, so we're going to break it down to the most primitive versions of what phase really is. So let's go back to our sine wave. Notice the way that our wave begins and ends. It starts with a peak, then down to a trough, and then up to a peak again. But what would happen if we added a microphone to the sound source and basically picked up a stereo image of the sound source itself with two different sets of signal? As long as the signals both reach each mic with a peak and a trough together, they will, in their combined sounds, be in phase and they'll enhance the overall stereo image. But if by polarity, or maybe even just by some off distance of unbalanced source position, the signals reach at opposite points in the waveform, they will be said to be out of phase and cancel each other out. Now, since being out of phase is really hard to do 100% in the real world, we normally perceive it as a loss of low end and a swishy, phasey sound in the overall tone when we use two mics. The soloing of each channel by themselves and then listening to them together, as well as switching the output to mono so you hear them combined in a mono form, usually allows the listener to detect any out of phase situations. And these phase situations are usually most easily resolved by moving the mic placement. Finally, when we're talking about waveforms, we need to include the element of the envelope, something we all know as ADSR in the industry. ADSR standing for attack, decay, sustain, and release. When we look at the attack phase of a waveform, it is usually specifically the beginning of the waveform all the way to its highest point. Different variations of the ADSR, and specifically the attack, will change the overall tone of an instrument. The decay of a waveform, also known as the initial decay, begins after the attack ends at its highest peak and is the transition from the attack to the leveled off sustain. In the sustain of a waveform, we see that the waveforms begin to flatline or level out in volume. These are very conducive for things like strings and vocals in terms of sound. It's not common to find a sustain in transient sounds such as drums, kick, snare, toms. And finally, the release of the envelope essentially is the last part of the waveform as it finishes leveling out at the sustain and it comes to a close to 0 dB. It is important to note that the ADSR of a waveform is not usually this simplistic in real-life situations, specifically because usually the end of one waveform is just the beginning of another. So today you've learned about sound, sound waves, phase, SPL, decibels, and many other things. I hope you've enjoyed your lesson for today. There'll be much more to come, and please follow me at vincecasas.com.